A man's cruel words sliced through the air, his anger directed at a young waitress. But what she doesn't know is that the man who steps in to save her is hiding a shocking secret. He's a billionaire, and his motives go far deeper than simple kindness. Will she fall into his web? Stay tuned to find out. The smell of sizzling bacon filled the air, blending with the soft hum of a radio playing an old country tune. It was one of those quiet, mundane afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever. Emily moved around the diner with the same steady rhythm she always did, wiping down tables, refilling coffee mugs, and exchanging small talk with the regulars. Her uniform, once crisp and white, had started to show signs of wear. The apron was stained from years of spills, and the hemline of her shirt had started to fray from constant motion. She smiled, always smiled, as she placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of an elderly man at the counter. "How's the soup today, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, the same question she asked every day. "Just right, Emily," he replied with a nod, his voice rough but kind. "Just like you." Emily chuckled softly, her cheeks flushing a little. She'd heard that line 1,000 times, but she appreciated the warmth behind it. It was the little moments like these that made the job bearable. The small, familiar kindness that came from people who didn't have much, but always shared what they could. But today was different. The quiet hum of the diner seemed to be overshadowed by something she couldn't quite place. Her hand shook slightly as she wiped down the next table, her mind racing with unspoken worries about rent, bills, and the phone call she'd missed earlier from her mom. But as she set down a fresh glass of water for a new customer in the corner booth, her attention snapped back to reality. The man at the table wasn't a regular. He sat with his back to the wall, arms crossed, his sharp suit seeming out of place in this small-town diner. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his face was hardened, though not unkind. But there was something about his posture, the way he seemed to be scrutinizing everything, that made her stomach tighten. "Excuse me," he called, his voice cutting through the din of the diner. Emily's heart skipped a beat, the sound of his voice taking her by surprise. She turned toward him, offering her usual smile. "Yes, how can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He glanced up at her, eyes dark and unreadable. "The coffee tastes burnt," he said, his tone flat but firm. "Can you give me a fresh pot?" Emily blinked, thrown off guard. She had served this man a coffee just 5 minutes ago, and it had been brewed fresh. She bit her lip, fighting the urge to explain herself, but instead nodded. "I'll take care of that right away." She turned, and as she walked toward the counter, she heard him mutter something under his breath. Too low for anyone else to hear, but loud enough for her to catch. "Typical," he said, almost to himself. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. She could feel her pulse quicken as a flush of frustration crept up her neck. It wasn't the first time someone had made a comment like that, like she was just a cog in the machine, a nobody who didn't matter, but something about the man's tone made it sting more than usual. As she poured a new pot of coffee, she took a deep breath. "Just get through this," she told herself. "Just a few more hours." But as she turned back to his table with the fresh cup, he was already glaring at her, his lips curled into a tight frown. "About time," he snapped, not even bothering to thank her. The words cut through her like a blade, and for a moment, she wanted to snap back at him, to say something sharp and smart, to let him know that she wasn't some invisible servant to be talked down to. But she didn't. She couldn't. "Is there anything else?" she asked instead, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. She set the cup in front of him, hoping it would be enough to end the conversation. He didn't even look up at her. His eyes remained fixed on his menu, his fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of the table. "No, that'll be all," he muttered, his tone dismissive. A lump formed in Emily's throat. She nodded quickly and turned away, retreating to the back of the diner where she could breathe again. The sting of his words lingered, but she forced herself to push it down. "Just get through this," she reminded herself again. "Just a few more hours." But as she wiped down the back counter, the sound of the man's chair scraping against the floor made her freeze. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "This coffee's still terrible. You need to do your job better." She turned slowly, forcing her smile back into place, but the effort felt like a mask slipping off her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice tight. Let me make it right. She started toward him, but the man leaned forward, his hand slamming down onto the table with a loud thud that sent a shiver up her spine. Do you even know what you're doing? He sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt. This is what happens when they hire people like you. People who don't care enough to do their job right. The word stung, sharper than the others. Emily froze, her hands shaking slightly as she clenched the rag in her fist. She wanted to snap, to tell him that she had more on her plate than he could ever imagine, that she was doing her best. But the words never came. Instead, she gave a strained smile and said, I'll get you a fresh cup. She turned away, the anger and embarrassment welling up inside of her like a storm ready to burst. She didn't understand why he was targeting her like this. Was it because of her job? Her appearance? Or was it just a twisted sense of power that came from his position? Before she could make it to the counter, the door to the diner opened with a soft jingle of the bell, and a man walked in. Taller than most, his posture straight, he exuded an air of confidence that immediately caught Emily's attention. He looked like someone who belonged to another world, one far removed from the small-town diner she called home. He glanced over at her, then at the customer in the corner booth. Without a word, he started walking toward the back of the diner, his eyes locked on the angry man at the table. The tension in the air seemed to shift as he approached, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't help but watch, feeling an odd sense of hope build within her. Even though she had no idea who the stranger was or why he was walking toward the storm brewing at the corner booth. Is there a problem here? The stranger asked, his voice calm but firm. The man in the booth froze, his mouth slightly ajar as though unsure how to respond. The diner, which had been buzzing with tension moments before, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Emily stood behind the counter, her back to the strange man as she tried to steady her hands. The order tickets fluttered on the kitchen counter in front of her, each one a reminder of the work piling up. Her mind raced, still replaying the cruel words of the man in the booth. She hated this feeling, like she was so small, invisible to the people who saw her as nothing more than a waitress. And she hated even more that she let him get to her. She could hear the exchange happening behind her, but she didn't dare turn around. The man who had intervened, this stranger with a presence that seemed to fill the room, had stepped in with authority, but his calm words seemed to have an effect that she couldn't quite grasp. Was it just the shock of his intervention? Or something about him that made her feel, even if only for a moment, like she wasn't alone in this fight? She could hear the raised voice of the abusive customer quieting, the words becoming less sharp, less venomous. It was like the storm had passed, leaving a stillness in its wake. And then everything went quiet. Turning slightly, she glanced over her shoulder at the two men at the corner booth. The angry customer, who had just moments before been practically spitting his words at her, now sat there, almost deflated. His posture had shifted from confrontational to submissive. The stranger, who had stepped in without hesitation, was speaking in a voice she couldn't quite hear from across the room, but there was something soothing in it, something that made the customer shrink back. Everything all right? She heard the stranger ask, his voice steady. The customer mumbled something incoherent, nodding quickly before turning his attention back to his coffee. He didn't even look up as he muttered, Yeah, fine. Emily exhaled quietly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. But the stranger, he didn't leave. He didn't rush out the door like most customers did. Instead, he settled into the booth across from hers, ordering a coffee as if he had all the time in the world. She wiped down the counter, the fabric of her apron feeling rough against her hands. She was aware of him still, aware of how he carried himself with an ease that didn't belong in a diner like this. He sat tall, his sharp features softened by the low light of the afternoon, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet confidence that drew attention without him needing to say a word. It wasn't arrogance. It was something else entirely. Something unspoken. Her curiosity gnawed at her. She had to know more about this man who'd stepped in without even thinking. Something in her wanted to believe that his intervention wasn't just because he saw her as a poor waitress or some object to be pitied. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she didn't know what he was really doing here. As she turned to pour coffee for another table, her mind wandered. Could it be possible that he was different? that he saw something in her that no one else had. He hadn't treated her like some inconvenience. He'd treated her like a person, like she mattered. But that didn't happen in places like this. Not for people like her. She wasn't supposed to matter. She shook the thought from her head. She had no room for fantasies. She had a job to do. And no matter how much she wanted to know about him, no matter how much he'd made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not when there were bills to pay, rent due in 2 days, and a pile of problems that didn't care who she was. Hey! A voice interrupted her thoughts, low and smooth, just the right tone to pull her back to the present. Emily blinked and turned toward the sound, finding herself looking at the man in the booth. He was looking right at her, those sharp blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Her heart skipped. It was strange. She'd been working here for years and never once had a customer singled her out like this. But there he was, drawing her attention without effort. She nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a calm whisper against the low buzz of the diner. It wasn't the usual empty, "How's your day going?" kind of question. He actually meant it. He wanted to know. Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck. Instead, she offered a weak, automatic smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." He studied her for a long beat, his expression unreadable. "You don't seem fine," he said, his words more of a statement than a question. She paused, caught off guard by his directness. A twinge of something close to vulnerability, flickered in her chest. She bit her lip, her gaze flicking toward the back door as if the exit might somehow provide an escape from this uncomfortable moment. "I'm doing okay," she said again, more forcefully this time, though she wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself. But the stranger didn't look convinced. His eyes softened just a fraction, the edge of something warm flashing behind them. "It's okay not to be okay," he said simply, as if he understood. She wasn't sure why, but something about his words cut through the walls she'd built around herself. Something about the way he said it made her feel seen, for the first time in a long while. She swallowed hard, but before she could respond, another voice broke the moment. "Everything okay here?" The familiar voice of the abusive customer rang out. The stranger shifted his gaze back to the man, his expression neutral but sharp. "Everything's fine," he replied, his voice cool but still carrying that authority. "How about you?" The customer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then mumbled something under his breath before slumping back, finally silenced. The room fell back into its usual rhythm, but Emily's mind was still racing. She stood there, frozen for a moment, watching as the man turned his attention back to his coffee. There was something about him, something magnetic that drew her in. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. Instead, she focused on the work in front of her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something she hadn't expected. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, Emily moving from table to table with automatic motions, her mind preoccupied with the man in the booth. There was no reason to feel so shaken by him. He was just another customer, albeit one who had come to her rescue. Yet, despite her best efforts to focus on the work, her thoughts kept drifting back to his calm, measured presence. The way he had taken control of that tense moment, stepping in with quiet confidence, had left an impression on her she couldn't shake. She could feel the undercurrent of the earlier encounter still humming in the air. The angry customer in the corner, who had been so quick to belittle her, was now silent, barely looking up from his coffee. Emily felt a flicker of something, relief, but the moment the door jangled open again, she knew what was coming. It was him, the rude customer. "Hey," he barked, his voice cutting through the low chatter of the diner. Emily turned slowly, her stomach tightening. She was already exhausted, and it wasn't even close to the end of her shift. He didn't give her a chance to react. "This coffee still tastes like crap. Are you seriously this bad at your job?" His words were louder now, filled with venom as he stood up, leaning toward her with one hand slammed down onto the table. Her heart sank. This was not how she wanted to end her shift. Her hands were still shaking from earlier, and this felt like too much. He was doing it again. He was pushing her, making her feel small. It was a game to him, and she was just his target. But this time, something was different. The stranger who had come to her defense earlier, the one who had stepped in with a calm authority that felt like a lifeline, was still sitting at the same booth. His eyes locked on the angry customer. Emily saw his fingers tighten around his coffee cup, his jaw setting. He was ready. "Is there a problem?" The stranger's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The room seemed to pause, every eye in the diner now on the scene unfolding at the booth. The abusive customer faltered for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite figure out how to respond. Emily held her breath. She knew what was coming. Another round of insults, another blow to her dignity. But then, the stranger spoke again. "Relax. You don't need to make a scene. This is a diner, not a war zone," he said, his tone soft but sharp with authority. Emily watched, wide-eyed, as the customer blinked, taken aback by the unexpected challenge. He looked between the stranger and Emily, confusion crossing his features. For a moment, it felt like the air was charged, like everything was teetering on the edge of an explosion. The man in the booth took another slow sip of his coffee, seemingly unfazed by the tension now flooding the room. "I'd hate to see you make a fool of yourself," he added, his voice low and calm. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet certainty that made the customer pause. The diner was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The rude customer swallowed hard, his face flushing red as he muttered something under his breath, a string of curses that nobody quite caught. He stood up abruptly, shoving his chair back. "Whatever," he growled, tossing a few bills on the table before storming out of the diner, the bell jingling behind him. And just like that, the storm was over. The room exhaled in relief, but Emily stood frozen in place. Her heart was still racing. She had been saved again. By a stranger, yes, but more than that, someone who didn't even flinch when faced with the kind of ugliness she'd had to endure for far too long. It felt unreal. It felt too good to be true. She glanced over at him, unsure what to do next. The diner seemed quieter now, the tension of the moment ebbing away. The man hadn't moved from his booth. His demeanor was calm, almost as if this were just another day for him, no different than any other. He looked up at her and smiled faintly, as though acknowledging her gratitude without saying a word. Emily felt her chest tighten, and before she could stop herself, the words were out before she could take them back. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. The question caught him off guard for just a split second, and his gaze shifted as if he were deciding how to answer. Then, with a small shrug, he set his cup down and leaned back in his seat. "I don't like seeing people mistreated, especially not for something as stupid as coffee." Emily blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of his answer. "But you didn't even know me." His lips quirked up slightly. "Does it matter?" She wasn't sure how to answer. She had never thought of someone doing something like that, standing up for her, without expecting something in return. In a world where kindness often came with strings attached, this man's act had been different, and that made her feel even more vulnerable than before. "Do you come here often?" she asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. He hesitated, then shook his head. "First time. I don't usually do this, but it looked like you needed help." The way he said it felt like an echo of something deeper, something unsaid between them. It left her feeling exposed in a way that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. Emily didn't know what to think about this stranger, about how much he had just changed the course of her afternoon with nothing more than a few words. She was still standing there, unsure of what came next, when he finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost as if he were afraid of prying. It was the question she hadn't been able to ask herself all day. The question that had been buried under the layers of exhaustion, guilt, and the crushing weight of everything she'd been carrying. "Am I okay?" She didn't know the answer anymore. Instead, she smiled, the same automatic smile she always gave. "I will be," she said, though it felt like a lie. But as she turned to get back to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something deep and unspoken that had passed between them in that single moment. And for the first time in a long time, Emily wondered if she was ready to face whatever came next. The rest of the shift passed in a haze, the sounds of clinking dishes and the low murmur of conversations becoming a dull background to Emily's racing thoughts. The man in the booth, John, she remembered from the coffee order, was still there. He hadn't left. He sat quietly, almost as if he were in his own world, sipping his coffee, flipping through a worn-out magazine, and occasionally looking out the window. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and each time, Emily felt a curious warmth stir inside her, a strange comfort, as though she'd known him far longer than just a few minutes. But there was also something else, something that made her uneasy. She couldn't pinpoint what it was, but it was a feeling that tugged at the edges of her thoughts. Around 4:30 p.m., the diner started to quiet down, the late lunch crowd thinning as people returned to their routines. Emily wiped down the counter with practiced motions, keeping her back to the rest of the room as she tried to focus. The bills in her pocket, the ones that she hadn't yet been able to pay, still haunted her thoughts. How was she going to make it through this month? As she turned to grab another rag, the familiar sound of the diner's bell jingled, signaling another customer entering. She tensed, knowing it was probably someone new, someone with a new set of expectations she'd have to meet. But when she turned around, it wasn't just another face. It was the man from the booth, John. He was standing in front of her now, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Can I get another coffee?" he asked, his voice light, but his eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart flutter for reasons she couldn't quite understand. "Sure," Emily said quickly, forcing a smile as she grabbed the coffee pot from the counter. "You sure you don't want anything to eat?" She had noticed how he hadn't touched the food menu, but maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. He shook his head, his smile deepening. "I'm good. Just the coffee for now." She poured the coffee into his cup, careful to avoid spilling. There was something about the way he was watching her that made her feel both grounded and off balance at the same time. As she set the pot down, their eyes met again, this time lingering a little longer than before. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to think of something to say, something to break the silence that was beginning to feel too heavy. "So," Emily began, not sure where the words were coming from, "what brings you here?" "I mean, I've never seen you before, so," she trailed off, her nervous laugh breaking the tension. "Are you just passing through?" John's expression softened, and for a second he seemed to consider her question, almost as though weighing whether or not to answer. "You could say that," he said finally, leaning forward just slightly. "I've been around the area for a while now, just observing." "Observing?" Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. John's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and for a split second, Emily felt the familiar rush of uncertainty flood her chest. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I tend to notice things. People like you. People who don't get enough credit for what they do." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "People like me," she repeated, unsure of what he meant. Was he referring to her job? Her life? There was something in the way he said it that felt almost personal. John didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting toward the window. For a moment, it felt like he was lost in his own thoughts, distant from the conversation. And then, as though snapping back into the present, he turned his attention back to her. "You're doing more than just serving coffee, you know. You're keeping things going. For people who need it." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just a compliment. It felt like an acknowledgement of everything she had been carrying. It felt like he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, and not just as a waitress who served food and poured drinks. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, suddenly feeling exposed. "I'm just trying to get through the day." John nodded, but there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. That's all anyone can do, really. But not everyone does it as quietly as you. Emily didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being noticed. No one in this town really saw her as anything more than what she did, nothing more than a waitress. But somehow, John had seen something else, something she wasn't sure she had ever let herself see. "I've been here for a while," John continued, his voice lowering. "Watching. Just noticing people who make things work when they don't have to." Emily swallowed, unsure where this conversation was leading. It felt like he was saying something more than just words, It felt like an invitation to something. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. Before she could ask more, a voice interrupted them. "Emily." It was Mrs. Turner, the diner's owner, calling from the kitchen. "Can you help me with this order?" Emily quickly turned to Mrs. Turner, a sense of relief flooding her at the interruption. She needed a moment to process what was happening, to figure out what to make of the stranger who had stepped into her life so unexpectedly. "I'll be right there," Emily called back, her voice shaky. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a few bills on the counter and stood up, his gaze lingering on Emily for just a moment longer. "I'll see you around," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of finality. Emily nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. She watched as he left, the door chiming behind him. For a moment, she just stood there, feeling the weight of his presence lingering in the air. She didn't know what to make of it, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had just been part of something bigger, something she hadn't expected. And though she tried to dismiss it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the strange man who had saved her earlier was more than just a passerby. He was someone who saw more than just what was on the surface. And in that moment, Emily wondered if he saw something in her she hadn't allowed herself to see before. As the diner returned to its usual rhythm, Emily couldn't help but wonder what had just happened here. The following days passed with a strange sense of quiet, like a calm before a storm that neither Emily nor anyone else in the diner could quite predict. John, the man who had stepped into her life so unexpectedly, hadn't returned. Each day, she found herself half expecting him to walk in, but he didn't. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She kept replaying his words in her head, the way he had spoken to her, the way he had made her feel seen when no one else ever did. She told herself she was just being dramatic, that he was just another person passing through. But the way he had looked at her, like he understood exactly what she was going through, had left a mark. It wasn't just the kindness, it was the depth of it. It was the way he had made her feel like there was more to her than just a waitress, more to her than just surviving day by day. But life didn't stop for feelings, and neither did the diner. Emily kept moving, her days blending into one another, filled with the endless cycle of orders, coffee refills, and tired conversations. There were moments, though, when she couldn't help but wonder if John had been real, or if he had been some kind of fleeting dream, a brief glimpse of something better. Then, one Thursday afternoon, the unexpected happened. It was nearing closing time, and the diner was mostly empty except for a couple of regulars and a few scattered late arrivals. Emily wiped down the counter, her movements automatic, when the door chimed open again. She looked up expecting a familiar face, but it wasn't a regular. It was him, John. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a brief moment, she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. She blinked, and there he was, standing in the doorway as if nothing had changed. His dark eyes met hers across the room, and there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. No, more than recognition. It was a deeper connection, something they had both shared in that fleeting moment last time. Without hesitation, he walked toward the counter, his steps purposeful. Emily's heart began to race as she fought to steady her breathing. What was he doing here? She had convinced herself that he was just another fleeting moment in her life, like all the others. But here he was, standing in front of her again. "Another coffee?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed her. John didn't immediately answer. Instead, he looked at her with that quiet intensity, the same way he had before. His gaze wasn't predatory, but it was searching. It was like he was trying to read her, to see what had changed in her since the last time they spoke. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "Actually, I think I need something a bit stronger today." Emily furrowed her brow. Was he joking? Was he trying to make small talk? But when she glanced at his face, she saw something else, a hint of seriousness in his expression. "Something stronger?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. John nodded slightly. "Yeah, I've been thinking about things. About life, I guess." The weight of his words landed in the air between them, and Emily felt a wave of uncertainty creep over her. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in the way he said it made her feel like he wasn't just talking about coffee. Before she could respond, he continued, "Look, I know I'm not a regular here, but I come back for a reason." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her nerves on edge. "What reason?" she asked, unsure of where this conversation was going. He hesitated for just a moment and then leaned forward slightly, as if he were about to share something deeply personal. "I'm not here because of coffee or small talk," he said quietly. "I'm here because I think you've got something more to offer than what you're doing here." Emily froze. Her hands trembled as she set down the rag she had been wiping with. Something about his words hit harder than she expected. She had always felt like just another face behind the counter, unimportant, unnoticed. But John, he saw something different in her. He was suggesting, no, insisting, that there was more to her than she even knew. "Look, I don't know you that well," he continued, his voice soft but insistent, "but I've seen people like you. People with potential, but stuck in a cycle they can't break out of." His words sank into her, the weight of them making her chest tighten. People like you. She had heard that phrase before in different variations, and each time it reminded her that she was never quite enough. Never enough to break free from this life. Never enough to escape the past that kept her anchored in the present. But John wasn't saying she wasn't enough. He was saying something entirely different. He was saying that there was potential in her. That she wasn't defined by the job, by the place she worked, or by the life she was currently living. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice shaking. John's gaze softened, and for the first time there was a warmth in his eyes, a gentleness that made Emily feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. "I think you know exactly what I mean," he said quietly. "I think you've been ignoring it, though. I think you've been ignoring yourself." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent so long convincing herself that she wasn't capable of anything more than this, that she wasn't worth more than this. Now here was this stranger, this man who barely knew her, telling her something entirely different. She felt her chest tighten, the flood of emotions overwhelming her. Could it be possible? Could someone like her really have more to offer? Could she really break free from the cycle she had been trapped in? John stood there watching her, waiting for her to respond, but Emily couldn't find the words. She wasn't sure she even wanted to answer. All she knew was that this moment, this unexpected conversation, had shaken her in a way she wasn't ready for. And yet, she couldn't deny that a small part of her wanted to believe him. She just wasn't sure if she could. The conversation with John lingered in Emily's mind long after he had left the diner. The rest of her shift felt like a haze, the chatter and clinking of cups fading into the background as she replayed his words over and over. "You've got something more to offer than what you're doing here." His voice echoed in her head, stirring up a mix of hope and fear that she didn't know how to handle. That night, after closing the diner and locking up, Emily sat on the small, worn couch in the cramped apartment she shared with barely enough space to breathe. The late-night silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. She thought about John's words and the way he had looked at her, as if he saw more than just a waitress behind the counter. But what did he see in her? Was it pity, or was there something else? She had always been so focused on getting by, surviving each day, paying the bills, making ends meet, that she never considered whether there was anything else waiting for her. A knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be this late? She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she stood, walking cautiously toward the door. When she opened it, standing there in the dim hallway was John. His presence seemed larger than life, his figure standing tall in the narrow corridor, dressed in a dark coat, his hands buried in his pockets. His eyes met hers, calm and unwavering. "John," she said, surprised to see him again, especially here. "What are you?" "I need to talk to you," he interrupted gently, his voice calm but urgent. Emily stepped aside, letting him in, her heart racing with confusion. What could he possibly want now? He had left the diner earlier without saying much more than a few cryptic words. As he entered the small apartment, he looked around with the same quiet intensity she'd noticed in him before, his gaze briefly flicking to the cluttered kitchen, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, and the worn-out furniture. He didn't seem put off by the modest surroundings. Instead, he seemed at ease. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier," John began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something more. "And I want to be honest with you, Emily." Her pulse quickened. She felt a twinge of nervousness, the kind that comes when you're about to hear something you didn't expect, but knew, deep down, you needed to hear. "I'm not just some stranger who wants to pass through your life," John continued. "I've been following your story for a while now. Not in a creepy way," he added with a half smile. "But I've been watching you." Emily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean, following my story?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not just any guy from the diner, Emily. I'm someone who can change things for you." Her confusion deepened, but a strange sense of recognition started to take shape. Something about his words, about his confidence, was beginning to sink in. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. John hesitated for a moment, then looked her directly in the eye. "I'm the CEO of a company, one of the biggest companies in the country." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. The words felt too foreign to fit together with the man standing before her. The man who had helped her in the diner, who had seen something in her that no one else had. "I'm not just here to offer you a job," he continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm here because I think you have potential. I've seen your work ethic, your resilience. You remind me of myself when I was starting out. I was in a place just like this, but I broke free. I want to help you do the same." She felt the weight of his words, the gravity of what he was offering, but it was overwhelming. "Why me?" she asked, her voice small. "Why would someone like you, someone who has everything, care about someone like me?" John's expression softened. "Because I know what it's like to feel stuck, to feel like you're invisible. I see that in you, Emily. I see the potential that's being wasted here, and I want to give you a chance to change that." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily stood frozen, her mind swirling with the enormity of the situation. She had never imagined that something like this, an opportunity like this, could ever come her way. She had lived her life in the shadows, convinced that she was destined to always be the girl behind the counter, the one who cleaned the tables and smiled through the pain. But here, in this small apartment, standing in front of her was a man who seemed to believe in her, someone who could change everything. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, overwhelmed. "This feels too unreal." "I know it's a lot to take in," John said gently, his voice sincere. "But I wouldn't be here if I didn't think you had what it takes. You don't have to make a decision now, but I want you to know that I'm offering you more than just a way out. I'm offering you a chance to become someone you didn't even know you could be." The room seemed to close in around her as she processed his words. Her chest tightened as the weight of the decision ahead of her settled in. Could she take this chance? Could she believe in herself the way John believed in her? He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers for an answer. "I'm not offering this to many people, Emily. Only to those I truly believe in." Her thoughts whirled, the uncertainty of her life, the struggles, the fear, mixing with the possibility of something better, something beyond the confines of the diner. John was offering her a chance, a doorway to a future she had never dared to imagine. But could she step through it? "Take your time," he said softly, noticing the hesitation in her eyes. "Just think about it. I'll be around, and when you're ready, you'll know." As John turned to leave, Emily felt a strange mix of hope and terror. For the first time in her life, someone had given her a chance to choose something more. The question now wasn't whether she was capable, it was whether she was willing to believe that she was. John paused at the door, looking back one last time. "Don't let fear hold you back," he said quietly, before stepping out into the night. Emily stood there alone, with nothing but the weight of his offer pressing down on her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel so invisible. She felt like something inside her had begun to awaken. The question now was simple. Could she take the leap? The following days were a whirlwind for Emily. The diner's clatter, the usual rush of customers, the tired shuffle between tables. Everything felt like background noise to the storm of thoughts inside her head. The conversation with John, the sudden opportunity he had laid out for her, replayed over and over. She couldn't shake it, no matter how much she tried to bury it under the routine of her life. Each morning, she woke up and stared at the old coffee pot on the kitchen counter, the same one she had used for years, making the same weak coffee she had come to depend on. The small apartment, with its peeling paint and creaky floors, had always felt like home. It was the place she knew, the place where she had always found a way to survive. But now everything felt different. John's offer, the chance to escape the rut she had been in for as long as she could remember, gnawed at her. She tried to convince herself that it was too good to be true, that people like her didn't get to walk into the kind of life John was talking about. She didn't belong in that world. She wasn't that kind of person. But something inside her resisted those thoughts, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to leap or stay grounded. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her reverie. It was a text from Mrs. Turner, the diner's owner. "Can you cover the late shift tonight?" the message read. Of course, Emily typed back automatically, not even thinking. She had agreed to pick up extra shifts for months, always needing the extra money to make ends meet. It was just another night in the same routine. But as she prepared to head out the door, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Her eyes were tired, her expression worn. And yet, for the first time, she saw something else in her reflection, a hint of possibility, a spark that hadn't been there before. As she walked into the diner, the familiar sounds of sizzling food and chatter greeted her like an old friend. But today, everything felt different. The booths, the counters, the worn-out floors, everything she had once accepted as the only reality was now a reminder of how far she had come, or how far she could go. Around 8 p.m., as she was refilling a customer's water glass, the door jingled again. She glanced up, automatically scanning for the usual customers, but then she saw him. John. He stood in the doorway, tall and steady, his eyes immediately finding hers. For a second, the noise of the diner seemed to fade as their eyes locked. "Can I get a seat at the counter?" John asked, his voice smooth, but with a hint of something deeper. She nodded, her heart skipping a beat. Without hesitation, he walked toward the counter and took a seat, his posture relaxed, like he belonged here, like this was just another stop on his day. But to Emily, it felt like more than that. He wasn't just here to drink coffee. He was here for a reason. As she moved behind the counter, preparing his coffee, she couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to have him here. Something about the way he made space for himself in this world that wasn't his own. It made her question her own limits. "Feeling better today?" John asked casually, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron before answering, "I don't know yet." Still trying to figure it out. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't demand anything, but offered understanding. "You don't have to figure everything out all at once." She caught her breath, struck by the simplicity of his words. "I guess I've been trying to do that for too long." John's eyes softened, his voice lowering. "Sometimes, you don't have to know where you're going. You just have to start walking." It was as though the weight of his words hung in the air between them, pulling her toward something, toward a future she had never dared to imagine. She wasn't sure if she was ready to walk that path, but for the first time, she felt like she could. She wasn't alone anymore. As she set his coffee in front of him, she looked at him, really looked at him, and asked quietly, "What made you come back? After everything, why would you help me?" He took a slow sip of his coffee, considering her question. "Because I see something in you, Emily, and I don't think you see it yet." The words hit her harder than she expected. There was a sincerity in his voice, a belief in her that she hadn't ever really had for herself. "You don't have to make a decision now," John added, his tone soft but firm. "But when you're ready, you'll know." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was ready. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. But she did know one thing. She wasn't willing to let this moment slip by. She wasn't willing to let this chance slip through her fingers. The night carried on, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. As she moved through the familiar rhythm of the diner, a thought began to grow inside her. A thought she hadn't allowed herself to entertain until now. Maybe it was time. Time to stop surviving and start living. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of what-ifs and could-have-beens. Maybe it was time to take that leap. When her shift ended and she was about to head out the door, Emily stopped for a moment, glancing back at John sitting at the counter. His eyes met hers, a wordless understanding passing between them. With a deep breath, Emily made her decision. And with that, she stepped into the unknown.